Prime Minister Bazargan, Foreign Minister Yazdi, and a Defense Minister, Dr. Mustafa Chamran. His first name is Mostafa, and his last name is Chamron. He used to be residing in the United States, and he was actually at Berkeley. I believe that he was teaching there in late 60s. Another former long-term U.S. residents. They all met in Algiers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is significant here. Brzezinski related the Carter administration policy and proposal to the Iranian, and he said as follows, I quote, "We are prepared for any relationship you want. We have a basic community of interests, but we do not know what you want us to do. The American government is prepared to expand security, economic, political, and intelligence relationships at your pace." Close quote. Regarding the Shah's assets in the United States, Brzezinski told the Iranians, I quote, "The door to our courts were open, and that they could sue for them anything they wished." Close quote. Obviously, this should have been an excellent news for the Iranian, and particularly for Prime Minister Bazargan, because that would have enhanced his ability to have a control over his government in Iran. This would have promoted a better relationship between Carter administration and Bazargan's government. But this would also clearly have weakened Khomeini's forces and those of the alliance. Because if this would have been the case, then they would have been out of business. Since the alliance objective was solidification of their own power and destabilization of the existing government of Carter and Bazargan, Brzezinski also obviously was alarming to a man that was with Bazargan Prime Minister. Who was this man? Was Yazdi. And the rest of the partners.
Mm-hmm.
Now, using the meeting as evidence that U.S. was undercutting the fundamentalist side and the relationship and the revolution, the alliance swung into action. They went to action. They immediately wanted to prevent any better relationship between United States government in Carter administration and Mehdi Bazargan provisional government of Iran. The meeting touched off a storm of protest from Khomeini supporters in Tehran. The Iranian media, and particularly Ayatollah Beheshti, who was the head of the Islamic Republican Party, they attacked Bazargan, who was all but convicted in the press as a traitor and the act of treason. On the morning of November 4th, the leading newspaper in Iran, Kayhan, Kahyan, that is, I'm getting the paraphrases from that newspaper, reported that the previous day the Iranian Revolutionary Party, which it was Beheshti's party, had demanded to know why Bazargan had to meet in Algiers with Brzezinski. And the main question that they posed was, why was there a need for contact with the United States at this peak of anti-U.S. sentiment in Iran? And if there was such a necessity for such a meeting, then why this meeting was conducted in such a high international level? Close quote. Now we come to takeover 2, which is the end of the new beginning. I'm going to code you something that is also the code. This code is going to give you the essence of what was going on in the United States at the CIA by the people that they were supportive of the Bush. I quote, "What do 52 American lives mean? Every Thanksgiving, hundreds of Americans die on the highways. What is the big deal, Mansoor?" Now, this is not referring to me.
Mm-hmm.
This callous remark was made early on during the hostage crisis by the rigid Republican loyalist at the CIA in charge of Iran desk.
Who was?
Okay, I don't know who it was, but this is a code to and stoned Mansoor. His first name is Mansur, and his last name is Rafizadeh. It's Rafizadeh.
He was a former Savak official.
Yes, he was a long-time Savak chief CIA liaison in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's how much value the life of 52 American hostages meant at the CIA among the pro-Bush Reagan loyalists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the removal of the Khashoggi from the U.S. Embassy on August 12 was not the last that Ambassador Sullivan trusted butcher that we heard of. While November 4th, 1979 marked the 15th anniversary of Khomeini's exile to Iraq, by the way, in 1963, after the uprising in June of 1963 that Khomeini made an alliance with General Ghani, finally he was actually forced out of Iran on November 4th, 1964. Of course, when he went to exile in Iran, and he was there till 1979. And this time, Mashallah Khashoggi, the CIA trainee, helped to secure the compound for the radical student following the line of Imam Khomeini.
Mm-hmm.
They charged the gate. They took the American embassy compound so swiftly that Gary Sick later on in his book, The October Surprise, he says, I quote, "They knew all of the key nerve centers of the embassy, and they moved swiftly to capture and blindfold everybody in the compound," close quote. Now, considering that the students never were inside the compound, they must have had the help, and that help was provided very gladly by the Savak CIA agent, Mashallah Khashoggi.
Who, of course, was placed in charge of security for the U.S. Embassy following the February 14th, 79 takeover.
And armed and trained by U.S. Embassy official William Sullivan and Mike Coughlin, who was the security expert.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's something that's very interesting here, and according to Banisat, Yazdi, when he walks into the room and he says, "The coup has taken place," close quote. Ayatollah Khomeini dubbed the second takeover as the Iran Second Revolution. Now, what is very interesting here is that there was an interchange between Foreign Minister Yazdi and the U.S. charger for Bruce Lincoln in Yazdi's office just after the hostages were seized, and that really is priceless. The charger for asked Yazdi, "Why don't you go to the embassy and restore order again, as he has done in February 14, 1979.
Mm-hmm.
As he went over there, supposedly he obtained the release of the hostages." And Yazdi, I quote, he replies, "Then the lives of the people in the embassy were in danger, but this time it is not true." Now, you have to understand that at that time, the attackers at the American embassy were all armed. This time, there are no, supposedly, based on all the official records that we have, there were no armed intruders. They were unarmed. There was no move by the American embassy to protect the embassy compound.
So basically the security on behalf of the Marines and the U.S. Embassy personnel was neutralized at this point?
Yes.
It's interesting,
There was
Fara.
nobody there to even protect the U.S. Embassy compound. And Mashallah Khashoggi and all these students, they walk in and they go to all the nerve center and they obtain the all the secret files, and they have also blindfolded all the hostages. Now, Ayatollah Beheshti, who also helped in securing the release of the hostages on February 14, was asked by the chargeofer, and he says that he appreciated, now this is Ayatollah Beheshti talking to Lincoln. He says, I quote, that he appreciated the problem but did not know whether he could be directly involved. While he regretted the events, he said it was natural reaction to the U.S. attitude and action, close quote. Now, on November 5th, 1979, the hostage takers were interviewed by the daily newspaper representative Kayhan, K-E-Y-H-A-N. The spokesman listed the reason for the seizure of American embassy and the hostages. And I quote, it says, the principle of our revolution is the struggle against U.S. They're talking about Carter. This has always been endorsed by Imam Khomeini. This principle, in addition to the recent mistake made by the Iranian government, referring to Bazargan delegation in meeting with American official Brzezinski in Algiers, and the discussion forced us to take this action. This action is in compliance with Imam Khomeini's directives for clerics, that's referring to fundamentalists. However, what speeded up our decision to take this action was to increase our attack against America. Now they are referring to Carter. In fact, this thought has been in our mind for some time. Our objectives are, one, to show our objection to American foreign policy towards Iran, the Middle East, and the world. Two, presently our demand is return of the Shah. But it goes on and makes a very important statement. This is what is more important than anything else in our mind, however, is to put political pressure on America, on President Carter, close quote. According to Banisat, the radical students, who are the Muslim students following the line of Imam Khomeini, as a group did not exist before November 4th, 1979. It's just been being formed. So he is stating that how could people that they didn't even have organization, they could have planned this. He stated to me in his interview that this action could have not been planned by the students. Rather, it was a plan generated and organized by certain member of Revolutionary Council, which Beheshti and Rafsanjani were members, and also Mr. Ibrahim Yazdi. We hear that on November 6, 1979, Mehdi Bazargan was forced to resign as a provisional prime minister. The Revolutionary Council, dominated by Khomeini's Islamic fundamentalists, essentially took over the government. On November 7th, again, Iran's daily newspaper Kayhan quoted Beheshti. I quote, "Bazargan had to go because he had deviated from Imam's line," close quote. Then we find Beheshti later revealed the truth behind his regret concerning the hostage-taking. On June 6, 1980, the official publication of Islamic Republican Party, Jumhuri Islami, it means the Islamic Republican Party, quoted its leader, and he says, I quote, "It is not our duty to get Carter re-elected," close quote. Now, if not Carter, then who was referring to? This is really astonishing admission that the hostage crisis was in fact a management tool designed to secure absolute control of Iran by the fundamentalists and occupancy of the White House for Reagan Bush by ushering President Carter to early retirement.
Okay, now let's backtrack just a little bit, Fara, for the benefit of the listening audience who may be losing some of the details in the forest of information that you're presenting. The takeover, of course, was represented in this country as having been executed by Iranian students, and the spin put by the American news media on the takeover was that this was the result of popular outrage in Iran, and that this basically helped to sweep Khomeini into power. What you're suggesting is that the students did not have the tactical capability, I should say, of taking over the embassy in the way that it was taken over. This strongly implicates Kashani in the takeover of the embassy, who previously was in charge of its security, and the takeover by the students was basically seized upon by Khomeini as the second Iranian revolution. And what you're suggesting, too, the information that you presented, is that the students basically were that whoever planned the embassy takeover was coming from the Iranian Revolutionary Council, and not the students themselves.
Absolutely.
Okay. And,
no question about that.
And the statement, which official was it that made the statement, it is not our duty to get Jimmy Carter re-elected?
That was the Ayatollah Beheshti.
Okay.
He was the leader of the Islamic Republican Party. He was the actual fundamentalist ideologue. He was the man that secretly visited United States in September 1978 when he went to meet with Ibrahim Yazdi in Houston, and then also he was very instrumental in obtaining the release of the hostages at the first takeover on February 14th, and he was the number 2 man in Iran. Now, I could go through a lot of issues, but what is significant is this. We have been led to believe that during the negotiation for the release of the hostages between Banisat and Carter administration representative, including the chief men of War and Christopher, that they were very much close by the March of 1980 to get the release of the hostages. But something happened that it didn't happen, and so the demand was changed, and many other things had changed. On March 1980, the Iranian daily newspaper, Kayhan, and I would, for the benefit of your listeners, if they would like to go to the library to look at it, is Kayhan number 19049. It was reported, and I quote, students holding the hostages made it publicly known that they wanted to turn them over to the Islamic Revolution Council and wash their hands of the matter. However, on March 3rd, 1980, Rafsanjani made a personal appearance to the embassy and convinced them not to turn the hostages over to the Revolution Council or to the Foreign Ministry and hold on to them, close quote. On March 6, 1980, the same newspaper reported again that the student emphatically declared that they were going to deliver the hostages to the Revolutionary Council. The Revolutionary Council met the same afternoon and agreed that perhaps the hostages could be delivered to the government agencies such as Foreign Ministry. However, despite this, Ayatollah Beheshti and Rafsanjani again ordered the student to continue holding the hostages, close quote. Obviously, they did not want anybody in the government of Banisat to make a deal for the hostages. On April 12, 1980, Rafsanjani publicly gave a signal to his partners within the alliance in the United States that the first of 2 mutual objectives had been already realized. And what are they? That day's edition of the Kayhan daily newspaper reported speech by him before the Friday prayers. I quote, "The Islamic Revolution in Iran is the biggest, most tested social laboratory in the history. It is discredited the assertion by America and other Western powers that Iran revolution is going towards communism. They can no longer make this claim. In fact, the realization of Iran's present situation has discredited them even before their own people. The clear, decisive message of our leader, referring to Ayatollah Khomeini, of our revolution has taken away this excuse from them," close quote. Now, again, we go back to the statement that we originally stated by John Foster Dulles, that when he was referring to the religion of the East are deeply rooted and have many precious values, their spiritual belief cannot be reconciled with communist atheism and materialism. That creates a common bond between us, and our task is to find it and develop it. For sure, they found it and they developed it. Now, the Yankees are coming. 2 days later, on April 14, the same newspaper, Kayhan Daily, reported the plans for hostages rescue attempt had been exposed. The article in that newspaper described a scenario which fit the subsequent actual attempt very closely. In addition, about the 2 days before the rescue operation was launched, Miles Copeland and a story rescue piece in the Washington Star, it too was virtual duplicate of the actual mission.
Right. In fact, one of the things that I included in Radio Free America number 31, recorded in the summer of 1987, was an account by Donald Freed in Los Angeles of this Miles Copeland article, which described quite accurately the plans that were supposedly covert at this time to rescue the hostages. And in that article, Donald Freed, which, by the way, was published in a now-defunct magazine called The Rebel all the way back in November of 1983, Donald Freed described the description by Copeland and how accurate it was, and mentioned that an Iranian newspaper carried an account remarkably similar to Copeland's at the same time. Copeland, a veteran CIA officer, and allied with the forces within the CIA that were hostile to Jimmy Carter.
Right. Now, allow me to also, at this stage, to say that watching that Banisat and Carter administration are in negotiation was like the whole thing was like a show, watching a double tennis match and not knowing that who the real partners were actually on the opposite side of the net. For instance, you have got Carter administration negotiating with Banisat on the tennis court, and they have got two partners, but their partners in reality were the partners of the other side without their knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine the confusion of the two other players on the court when neither of them can seem to hit the ball.
Right. Now, it should be mentioned, too, at this point, that the Desert Run 1 hostage rescue mission was, of course, a very dramatic failure and confirmed the image of Jimmy Carter as a bungler in the public's mind.
Yes.
And it had a great deal to do, obviously it left the hostages in Iran, but it had a great deal to do with sealing the image in the minds of the American people that Jimmy Carter was professionally incompetent. I would also note that among the people involved with the Desert One hostage rescue plans were Richard Secord and another Iran-Contra player named John Dutton.
Yes.
Which, of course, raises some questions about the security of the operation itself. We have two people who are players in the Iran-Contra scandal. Richard Secord, a longtime intimate of this cabal, this group of intelligencers, such as Eric von Marbod, Carlucci, and other people in the Turple-Wilson orbit that we've been speaking about, and who were very close to George Bush, Theodore Shackley et al.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, the ball in this game of keep away was, of course, the 52 American hostages.
Mm-hmm.
The game was the so-called hostage crisis that it was made to be a crisis. If ever an event could have destabilized the Carter administration and the provisional government of Iran, the hostage crisis was it. As one issue over here that we are going to look at, that how the destiny of the hostages was not really in the hands of Banisat and Carter administration. Regardless what deal would have been made, the hostages were meant to be remain till all the objectives were reached later on. Now the question comes here, was this all a chaos or was controlled? The Islamic Revolution was chaotic, of course, we know that. I mean, the whole emergence of the fundamentalists to power and all the events and many events that have taken place in Iran. It looked like a chaos. But then, so is the football game if you don't understand the rules. I mean, the American football, because you know that there are different football games in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Dallas Cowboys of 1970s had made something very effectively, the use of it, which is a controlled science of offensive football, with fascinating results. Similarly, the Cowboys of the CIA operations director of the Spook Network, or the pro-Bush loyalists at the CIA, had made a controlled science also out of their game, which it was a covert operation, except they played for keeps.
Mm-hmm.
They had access to powerful supercomputer manned by brilliant social scientists utilizing all the accumulated intelligence data supplied by military, political contacts, and covert operatives and all the analysts that they had.
Mm-hmm.
It could have really made the endless scenarios of all these different events, and most importantly, they had a previous championship game experience, and that was the 1953 CIA coup in Iran.
Mm-hmm. So, by the way, I should mention, for the benefit of people who hear this on tape, the football metaphor is sort of apt because today is January 31st of 1993, and America has just finished its great spectacle, the Super Bowl, this year featuring the Dallas Cowboys and the Buffalo Bills. Go ahead.
That's correct. That 1953 CIA coup was considered by most of the intelligence agencies around the world to be a definite model for covert operations. It has been mentioned over and over and over. Therefore, it was only natural that some of that old vets should sit up again when the growing instability in the late 1970s in Iran was putting the opportunity right into their lap. The method in all this madness is something called control science. And of course, to explain what it is, there's some sort of an algorithm or a very simple logic, which is a problem, process, and solution.
By the way, Fara, I would like to jump in at this point. You made a very good point. As you talked about the CIA's and the national security establishment supercomputers, the people that man them, and the enormous amount of data that can be fed into any given problem that they are directed to solve. One of the elements of political reaction, and by the way, if we have time tonight, Fara, I'd like you to comment on the reaction of the so-called progressive political sector in this country, as well as the mainstream, to any research dealing with the U.S. intelligence community and with things of this kind. There is a knee-jerk reaction in which it is deemed, quote, conspiracy theory, unquote, and automatically dismissed. And unfortunately, this tendency exists almost as much in the so-called progressive political sector as it does in the mainstream of American politics. But people who would dismiss the sub rosa machinations of our intelligence system and who maintain that, well, they just couldn't pull off a conspiracy like this, are overlooking the tremendous resources which are at their disposal, namely the finest supercomputers, the most brilliant people to operate them, and an enormous amount of raw data to be fed in for any given operation. So I'm glad you made that point, because it's something a lot of people forget, that operations of this kind are the outgrowth of the manipulations by some of the most formidable and capable people on Earth and institutions on Earth at this time. The notion of the CIA and other American intelligence agencies as a bunch of bunglers or the gang that can't shoot straight could not be farther from the truth. Go ahead.
Now, the methodology behind the simultaneous transition of power in Iran and also in the U.S. at the close of the 1970s, in fact, by itself is a case study in control science. The problem for the pro-Bush loyalists within the intelligence community was the pending demise of the Shah. Mm-hmm. Knowing that the Shah had a cancer and one way or another he's going to die, and the fact of the matter is that the Shah did die in July of 1980, and we are forgetting that if Shah was in Iran, who would have been the replacement for him? Mm-hmm. The potential loss of the U.S. huge investment, on the other hand, and the perceived threat of the communist takeover in Iran, because that was the excuse for the 1953 CIA coup in Iran. Mm-hmm. And the process was the selection of this pro-Bush loyalist within the intelligence community of the Islamic fundamentalists as a successor to the Shah, that we have documented that so far. And the systematic removal of obstacles to their rise to power. And that was the removal of President Carter and also the sitting government in Iran. The solution was enact communist-free Iran under Islamic fundamentalist rule and the installation of Reagan-Bush in the White House in the United States. Now, the glue that held this whole thing together was something that we learned to accept: hostage crisis. Khomeini's only route to power was an indirect route. How? First, he had to work with the government of religious reformists of moderate, so-called moderate, who were actually also anti-communist and anti-left, and that was the common denominator between them. Mm-hmm. Had he tried to seize the control right away, the left, which actually defeated the Shah's army or were very instrumental from late 1970s and all the way in February 9th to 11th that they were fighting the Shah's Royal Army, he would have been stopped Khomeini would have been stopped by the forces of the National Front and the left and the democratic forces in Iran. So he needed the moderates or the reformist religious as both a buffer and interim government. And we saw that is exactly what happened. The first move that they made was, as we have seen, they had to discredit and neutralize the left by using the provisional government of Iran to prevent them from participating in the new government. The next phase was to focus Khomeini's authority by standing up to the great Satan, which in fact was Carter, which has debunked Iran through the Shah and provided all the help to the Shah, and also was trying up to February 11, 1979, to see whether there is a possibility of the coup to save his regime by diminishing that of Iran's government.
Oh, okay. Now go on with the hostage crisis. Yeah, to solidify Khomeini's power.
Khomeini played his part as a major actor, fantastically.
Mm-hmm.
He came up with the slogan, "Death to the Great Satan." He even intimidated Mike Wallace on the American TV. The secret files that it was found at the American embassy which had been carefully edited by Khomeini's American partners. That files cast the members of the Iran's provisional government, not Khomeini's crowd, in a bad light by showing their connection with the great Satan and its nest of spies, because Khomeini referred to the American embassy in Tehran as the nest of spies. Now, the Iranian government, which it was the provisional government and then also the Bani Sad government, could never get their hands on the hostages, despite several offers by the students that they wanted to take them over to the government, but that was all destroyed and diminished by Beheshti and Rafsanjani. Rafsanjani presently is the current ruler. And they refused to allow this happen. As a result, the government of Bani Sad became increasingly impotent. Simultaneously, the Republicans, they were trying to keep reminding the American public how President Carter's helpless captivity in the White House was really getting too much and was not going to be a campaign issue.
Now, how was Bani Sadr being portrayed as inept by the Khomeini forces? How did this dynamic work to weaken Bani Sadr?
Because Bani Sadr, he was actually a protege of Khomeini.
Mm-hmm.
He used to call him one of my sons.
Okay.
But the fundamentalist ideologue in Iran, they wanted to have the power within their hand. And Bani Sadr was not really one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he cooperated with them. Even on the 9th of November, he endorsed the hostage-taking. But he was not able to make a decision. Without Khomeini, he would have never become the president. And
okay.
if Khomeini was not on his side, he would have never made it to become the president of the United States. I mean, the president of Iran. While the Iranian government of Bani Sadr was rendered ineffective by the hostage crisis, Khomeini was able to unite Iran and the Iranian by using their slogan such as Great Satan. President Carter was holed up in the White House, and then we saw that candidate Reagan and Bush were able to rally the American public with a patriotic rhetoric calling Khomeini's regime murder incorporated, and vowing never to bargain with terrorists, at least until Iran-Contra, that we found out that was not the case. And what we find, why was the central question to this whole thing is, why were the hostages taken in the first place? Really, if you look at the situation and all the explanation that has been given, this question has never clearly has been explained. Why? Now, pundits and experts, everybody has always mumbled the conventional line that a bunch of crazy Iranian or students, they grabbed the American hostage in response to President Carter's having admitted shot to the United States. But the question is why? The hostage-taking was clearly against every national Iranian interest. Even a simple reasoning would alert us that such a flimsy excuse would not hold water. Now, had the Shah's admission to the United States been the motive for taking the American embassy hostages November 4th, 1979, then we have to ask, why had the Americans first been taken hostages at the embassy on February 14, 1979? Because at that time, there were no Shah in the United States.
Okay.
Furthermore, why were the hostages not released if the Shah was the excuse? when the Shah died on July 27, 1980.
Okay, again, let's reiterate that on February 14th of 1979, what we're terming the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Tehran, the U.S. Embassy experienced an abortive takeover. Prior to that, William Sullivan eliminated the possibility that the U.S. Marine Guards could have used automatic weapons, basically preparing the way for this takeover. That allowed Marshala Kashani, a CIA Savak protege, to assume authority for security of the embassy with some Islamic fundamentalists trained, and the takeover was blamed on the Iranian left, trained by CIA Savak, and then Kashani leads the takeover of the embassy in November of 79, and again the Shah dies in July of 1980. Good point, go ahead.
Right. Now, the question is this: why were the 52 hostages made to suffer for 444 days? I say no pain, no gain.
Okay.
Now, there is one thing that in the old days, in the Romans, when they wanted to find out or examine the result of any complicated situation, they always ask what prodest. It's Q-U-I and P-R-O-D-E-S-T. It means who gains.
Mm-hmm.
In order to be able to understand who really gained in this, because the gain was not only for Khomeini, because there were other gains too. Now we have to look at some of the alternatives, because then we understand exactly what was going on. Number one, we have heard many times that the hostages were going to be put on trial, or the hostages are going to be shot, or the hostages are going to be harmed. Now, had the hostages been harmed, Carter would have been forced to take military action. There would have been no other alternative for Carter. His prestige in U.S. would have gone up. Khomeini would have been disgraced in Iran as the one that who really brought the wrath of the great Satan upon the people of Iran. The second issue is, if in the event, if the hostages were rescued, had the hostages been rescued, Carter would have been a hero. Khomeini would have been embarrassed and out of business with no leverage against the Iranian government. That's why that the rescue operation could have never been successful, and that's why that they really sabotaged the rescue operation. Third, had the hostages been released by the Iranian government, arrangement would have been made by Bani Saad and by Carter. Carter would have been vindicated. The Iranian government would have seen in control, thus establishing power and authority in Iran. So that didn't happen either. Now the fourth alternative is, had the hostages never been taken, then the Khomeini regime would have not been able to easily destabilize the moderate government, a provisional government of Barzakhan, with damaging U.S. Embassy edited secret files and unite the Iranian population behind the Islamic Revolution. And also the Republicans would have not been able to have such a club in which they could have made President Carter look like so incompetent and unite the American people behind the quote-unquote Reagan Revolution. The four alternatives that I have stated precludes any possibility of the alliance between the pro-Bush or loyalists within the intelligence community, or I call them the spook network, and the Khomeinis having achieved its two absolute goals: Iran intact and communist free, and the control of the White House. However, the inevitable solution, that is the only solution, which allowed that alliance to be able to achieve all their objective, was the hostage crisis. As history has proven, and we have seen, Khomeini's Islamic fundamentalists have dominated Iran ever since. Reagan became the first two-term president since Ike, and George is more or less, even though that he's out of the White House, but he is still there. And he said, I will do whatever is necessary to be reelected. So it seems, and that's exactly what he did. And
it should be noted that the geopolitical objectives realized by the Reagan and Bush administrations together represent the culmination of Western industrial policy going even back before the Second World War. The Soviet Union, the evil empire, has been broken up into its constituent ethnic republics, a geopolitical goal which predates World War II. That was a goal that was adopted by the Nazis and the Ostministerium of Alfred Rosenberg, namely the disintegration of the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics, but it really represented a geopolitical goal which even predates the Bolshevik Revolution. The British Empire used to play what was known as the Great Game, the containment and hopefully the ultimate dissolution of the old Imperial Russian Empire, then anti-communists, anti-Bolsheviks, in the period between the two world wars, exemplified by something called the Promethean Network, undertook to break up the Soviet Union, to foment nationalism among the various ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, or ethnic components of the Soviet Union, and ultimately the goals realized by these administrations, the Reagan and Bush administrations, as I said, they represented the culmination of Western foreign policy, not just in the post-World War II period, but going all the way back to the end of World War I. The goals achieved couldn't be more enormous or more far-reaching, and I also would add that in the United States proper, the right-wing agenda was realized as never before in the post-World War II period. So the importance of this covert operation, a covert operation of long standing, a covert operation which installed the Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran, and which also installed the Reagan and Bush administrations in the United States. The implications could not be exaggerated. I would also state, Fara, that what we're looking at in this scenario is another manifestation of something which I've been harping on for years in these broadcasts, namely the important realization that the types of covert operations which the United States has long been known to conduct abroad, such as the destabilization of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, or the destabilization of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, these same things go on in the United States, perhaps the most dramatic example being when John Kennedy got his brains blown out in broad daylight in 1963. The U.S. intelligence community does the same thing here at home. Go ahead.
Now, as the Sundance Kid once asked Bush Cassidy, he asked, who are those guys?
Mm-hmm.
And let's see who are these guys.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have got Richard Helms. Richard Helms, of course, is one of the most enduring symbol of the controversies and legend of the CIA.
Okay.
In 1979, as the director of the CIA, he commented, I quote, "The nation must, to a degree, take it on faith that we, too, are honorable men devoted to her service," close quote.
By the way, he was not CIA director in 79, though.
71.
Oh, 71. Okay, go ahead. Right.
As we know, that the last medal that Helms received before leaving the CIA in 1973 was the Distinguished Intelligence Medal for Services in February 1973.
Mm-hmm.
After his term as a U.S. ambassador to Iran from 1973 to 1976, Richard Helms set up a consultancy firm in Washington, D.C., and the name was Safir. Safir is an Iranian name for means ambassador.
Okay, which of course to show that Helms, after leaving his position as Director of Central Intelligence, became Nixon's ambassador to Iran, and in that capacity he, according to your research, Fara, became the first to learn about the Shah's cancer. Go ahead.
Fundamentalist side and the relationship and the revolution, the alliance swung to action. They went to action. They immediately wanted to prevent any better relationship between United States government in Carter administration and Mehdi Bazargan provisional government of Iran. The meeting touched off a storm of protest from Khomeini supporters in Tehran. The Iranian media, and particularly Ayatollah Beheshti, who was the head of the Islamic Republican Party, they attacked Bazargan, who was all but convicted in the press as a traitor and the act of treason. On the morning of November 4th, the leading newspaper in Iran, Kayhan, K-A-H-Y-A-N, that is, I'm getting the paraphrases from that newspaper, reported that the previous day the Iranian Revolutionary Party, which it was Beheshti's party, had demanded to know why Bazargan had to meet in Algiers with Brzezinski. And the main question that they posed was, why was there a need for contact with the United States at this peak of anti-U.S. sentiment in Iran? And if there was such a necessity for such a meeting, then why this meeting was conducted in such a high international level? Close quote. Now we come to takeover 2, which is the end of the new beginning. I'm going to code you something that is also the code. This code is going to give you the essence of what was going on in the United States at the CIA by the people that they were supportive of the Bush. I quote, "What do 52 American lives mean? Every Thanksgiving, hundreds of Americans die on the highways. What is the big deal, Mansoor?" Now, this is not referring to me.
Mm-hmm.
This callous remark was made early on during the hostage crisis by the rigid Prime Minister Bazargan, Foreign Minister Yazdi, and a Defense Minister, Dr. Mustafa Chamran. His first name is Mostafa, and his last name is Chamron. He used to be residing in the United States, and he was actually at Berkeley. I believe that he was teaching there in late 60s. Another former long-term U.S. residents. They all met in Algiers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is significant here. Brzezinski related the Carter administration policy and proposal to the Iranian, and he said as follows, I quote, "We are prepared for any relationship you want. We have a basic community of interests, but we do not know what you want us to do. The American government is prepared to expand security, economic, political, and intelligence relationships at your pace." Close quote. Regarding the Shah's assets in the United States, Brzezinski told the Iranians, I quote, "Republican loyalists at the CIA in charge of Iran desk."
Who was?
Okay, I don't know who it was, but this is a code to and stoned Mansoor. His first name is Mansur, and his last name is Rafizadeh. It's Rafizadeh.
He was a former SAVAK official.
Yes, he was the longtime SAVAK chief CIA liaison in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's how much value the life of 52 American hostages meant at the CIA among the pro-Bush Reagan loyalists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the removal of the Khashoggi from the U.S. Embassy on August 12 was not the last that Ambassador Sullivan trusted butcher that we heard of. While November 4th, 1979 marked the 15th anniversary of Khomeini's exile to Iraq, by the way, in 1963, after the uprising in June of 1970, the door to our courts were open, and that they could sue for them anything they wished, close quote. Obviously, this should have been an excellent news for the Iranian, and particularly for Prime Minister Bazargan, because that would have enhanced his ability to have a control over his government in Iran. This would have promoted a better relationship between Carter administration and Bazargan's government. But this would also clearly have weakened Khomeini's forces and those of the alliance. Because if this would have been the case, then they would have been out of business. Since the alliance objective was solidification of their own power and destabilization of the existing government of Carter and Bazargan, Brzezinski also obviously was alarming to a man that was with Bazargan Prime Minister. Who was this man? Was Yazdi. And the rest of the partners.
Mm-hmm.
Now, using the meeting as evidence that U.S. was undercutting the